Hello, everybody. It's Thursday, March 26th, day 11 of the national self-isolation situation with the coronavirus. And it's also a very special day in the history of medicine. It's a day in the world of viruses that gives us cause to rejoice and a sense of hope for the future. Because it was on March 26th, 1953, 67 years ago, that Jonas Salk unveiled for the first time to the public that a vaccine was possible for the dreaded poliomyelitis virus. Polio, as we call it, infantile paralysis, some people referred to it as. But it was a virus, and it was a very, very bad one. It was not just something that popped up in 1953, and Jonas Salk did something about it, but it was a virus that had been inflicting horrible injury and death upon the world for decades, some say even centuries, because it was a virus that had there was no comprehension of where it came from, how it was transmitted, and there was no cure for it whatsoever. There were no treatments. Once you got it, you just dealt with it, and whatever the consequences were, that's how you had to live with it. And some people didn't live with it. In 1952 alone, there were somewhere between 25 and 50,000 cases of polio in the United States. The numbers vary from record to record, so we're not totally accurate on that, but there were at least 3,000 deaths, and many of those were children. And the ones who were left behind, because it was a disease that affected the central nervous system, there was often crippling, breathing issues. There were nearly always breathing issues. The lungs were the first organs to be hit by polio, and it had, depending on the severity of the case, it had huge ramifications. Now, fortunately, there were a few people that basically had the effects of the flu or a bad cold. It didn't get to the lungs somehow, but they were very, very rare. I went to school with some children who were a little bit ahead of me in years, and consequently they were not able to have the vaccine, or what we called the dreaded inoculation, in time to avoid getting the disease. And they were in wheelchairs, or they had varying types of disability, physical disability, because of what the polio did to their bodies. So it was a bad thing, a very bad thing. Well, Jonas Salk was a child of Russian immigrants. They were Ashkenazi Jews who escaped to the United States in 1914, and they lived in New York City. And we don't know the detail, or I don't know the details of why Jonas Salk was attracted to dealing with virology, viruses, but we know that one of his first goals as a young medical student, doctor, and research person, one of his personal goals was to find a cure for influenza, particularly the influenza that hit the United States after World War I. We call it the Spanish flu, or the 1918 influenza. Anyway, that was his initial focus. But then, when he went to the University of Pittsburgh, he began doing research with his mentor, who together they focused on trying to find some type of treatment or vaccine for poliomyelitis. And anyway, the story is quite fascinating. You can read about it. on the Smithsonian magazine if you want lots of details, and it compares what Salk did with what Sabin did, who later developed an oral vaccine, which has become the standard in the world. And basically now, 2020, the world is pretty much polio free. That doesn't mean it couldn't come back, because the same viruses are out there, but they can be, we can be protected against them through the work of Jonas Salk. Now, this day in 1953 was the day that he announced there was a vaccine possible, but nobody wanted to be inoculated. So what happened? Jonas himself, his wife, and his children were the very first human beings to be inoculated with the polio vaccine. And that seemed very heroic to me. They were willing to become a blessing so that other people could be blessed. And they took a great risk, although I think Salk was pretty much convinced that it was going to work. But they didn't know that 100%. And so he and they lived through it perfectly well. And then the following year, a case study across the United States, 2,000 school children between the ages of 6 and 9 became the test study. Half of them received his vaccine, half of them received a placebo, and then the world waited. And then on April 12th, 1955, April 12th, if you are thinking ahead, is Easter this year. So on Easter of 2020 will be the 65th anniversary of the pronouncement to the whole world that a vaccine was available and would be immediately accessible to every person on the planet. And that began to happen that very week, and as they say, the rest is history. So I'm telling you all that, not just to do a that's the rest of the story kind of a thing, but to just give us a sense of hope. And we are just overwhelmed by all this negative, bad news, and our hearts break at the loss and the suffering and just the incredible economic impact of this virus. But viruses like this, or not like this, but of great severity, have been around for a long time. In fact, in the days of polio, when it was at its peak, hospitals wouldn't even accept polio patients, partly because they didn't understand how it was transmitted, so they were afraid of their whole staff and all the other patients being infected. The only way anybody got any kind of treatment, really, was when brave nurses and doctors came to their home and fitted children with braces, and that was about it. That was almost the totality of treatment, other than the dreaded iron lung, which was one of the early ventilators, respirators, that basically your body went into this massive tank, and through a changing of pressure, it caused your lungs to move up and down, and it was forced inhaling and exhaling, and it was a dreaded thing. And there are pictures out there of gymnasium-sized spaces filled with these iron lungs. So it was a bad, bad thing. And the whole world knew it, and the whole world saw it, and it happened year after year after year, peaking in 1952. But Salk was committed. He and Sabin later were very much committed to ending this dreaded international plague that had really been affecting life on the planet for many, many years. And it worked. And we are the recipients of that success. But none of that would have happened without the vision and the hope of people like Salk and Sabin, who committed themselves at whatever risk to themselves to be a blessing to the world. So I'm going to play a medley today of songs about hope and blessing. And the first one is a song that I wrote for a musical that I wrote for our church here in Huntington Beach back in, I started saying 1955, whoa, 2005. it was a musical called "'Twas the 11th Night Before Christmas," and polio was a part of it because the story of my musical took place in 1955, and one of the elements of the storyline was a grieving family who had lost a child to polio. And the father was very depressed, and but yet committed to making a difference in the world, even in his loss. And a pastor friend encouraged him with some very powerful words that even though there are not always answers to the questions that we have, we just need to trust that God is in control, and we need to lift our eyes, because even in the cloudiest, darkest sky, above that, the sun is shining brightly, and we just need to realize that God is faithful. So I'm going to be playing that song, which is entitled "Lift Your Eyes," and then a song that my mother used to sing. Some of you have heard of it. It's called "Whispering Hope." And then the hymn, "My Hope is Built on Nothing Less Than Jesus' Blood and Righteousness." And finally, a song to hopefully rally us all to make the best of this situation and become a blessing. Make me a blessing.
I encourage you to be full of hope and be a blessing. See you tomorrow.